One of the guys that I've known for many years who's one of the great doers of our time is Michael Lydon. Well, Michael and his team and partners have really come up with a way of, if you would, doing demonstration projects. Let's try something out and see how it works and play with it a little bit and see where it's going to go. With that, I just want to introduce one of the better guys I know at doing this stuff, Michael Lydon, urban planner, writer, author, and a great guy. Thanks, Mike, for coming all the way up here.
It's nice to be with you all. I don't know this part of the state very well. I was just telling Lou to give me a little bit of background about where I am. I've done a lot of travel up and down the Hudson River Valley, but not really kind of reached this corner. So I'm interested in learning more about the challenges and things that you're working on today through the Q&A. Our firm, Street Plans, we are about 9.5 years old now. We have offices in Brooklyn and also in Miami, which is where I started the company with my partner, Tony, who runs our office down there. We do a wide array of project types. We work on cycling and transportation, we work on public spaces, we do zoning and architecture, a lot of research, writing and advocacy. So we're involved with a lot of different kinds of things with many different types of community groups, with foundations, with developer clients, with a lot of mostly city clients. So, we get a lot of different perspectives through our work and through our projects. This chat this morning with a better understanding of what tactical urbanism is. That's a wonky term, and of course I'm going to explain it more today. I hope you can understand how it can improve the project planning, development, and delivery process. In the end, we're looking to, yes, use short-term projects, but this is about the longer arc of transforming our communities. And then finally, I hope you'll commit to thinking about projects and carry them forward and deepening this practice in wherever you can affect change here in Orange County and beyond. So envisioning change is something that we as planners, as designers, love to engage with, right? This is what I find to be the most exciting part of the job, is thinking about where some place is today and what are the possibilities for where it may go longer term, right? So this is actually a community in Idaho, one of the smaller communities we've worked in, about 1,000 people on Lake Pend Oreille. And this was a vision for a state highway road to bring in more of a village center, which is desired by the community, improve the walkability, and then add some cycling facilities, as you see there on the right corner. So from this to that. But unfortunately, this is the easy part. Coming up with that vision and those ideas and that design doesn't take that much time, right? It can be informed by the community through a lot of outreach and public process. But the challenge is to take these lovely people and get them to say, we want to embrace this change. Because oftentimes this is the actual result, right? So when you actually start to try and do something, this is the general response. And I think part of the challenges that we all face as doers and change makers is that conventional planning and conventional town making is very slow and is very expensive, right? This constrains our politicians and community leaders who really do struggle to balance both the long-term vision and creating that vision with the community, but then actual tangible action on the ground over the course of a single political term, right? So this is a really strong tension in our cities and our towns. The process, because it's so drawn out, because it requires people with free time and resources to typically engage over these periods of time, unintentionally excludes the vast majority of our communities, right? So that's a challenge. And then I think what this gets us to in the end is a lack of trust in government institutions. And when there's a lack of trust, there's a lack of project delivery, we leave a lot of value creation for our communities, unrealized. And so that's one of the areas we really try to focus on is, come up with that vision, but then act really, really quickly so that value can be created from the start and build very slowly over time as the resources can be gathered. Or put more eloquently, as Jane Jacobs, the urbanist and famous author, wrote in the 60s, city planning lacks tactics for building cities that work like cities. And I think what she meant by that is that when you think of great towns and great places, whether it's a village or it's New York City, there's lots of little decisions that have been made over time incrementally, and those add up to, these places that feel very enriching, that have history, that feel connected, that have many hands that are involved in the making of the place. And city planning as a discipline, starting in the 50s and 60s, really got away from that thinking. And we've really struggled as a profession to get back to the incremental and the small scale. It's usually about the top down and the big. So we need new ways to build our cities together, and that's very much what we focus on. And one of our techniques has become what we call tactical urbanism, which is an approach to neighborhood building that uses short-term, low-cost, and scalable projects that are intended to catalyze long-term change. And the word in pink that's in bold, intent, that's really important to what we're talking about, because when we go and paint the corner of a street or shut down the road for an event, we're doing things for a bigger purpose than just the fun of doing that. There's lots of reasons why you would go paint the street, but for us, it's really about the geometry. It's about showing people what's possible and getting that momentum built. So we're looking 30 years ahead, but we're acting, within 3 days. So we've taken this concept and we've, iterated upon it for many years now, and we've written these guides, first starting with ourselves and some local collaborators here in the States, but then we've gone and partnered with NGOs around the globe to create subsequent guides that are more relevant to those contexts. And so we actually have one coming out in Japan relatively soon. But in 2015, we wrote a full-length book. So like a tactical project that develops over time in iterations, the first 4 manuals that we wrote, which are usually about 25 or 30 pages, kind of helped us create this book and really write it with a little bit more knowledge, because we were practicing the idea of it for 5 years. There's a materials and design guide, which those of you who are successful with your grant applications for such projects moving forward, I would suggest you download that. All these are available on tacticalurbanismguide.com. The materials and design guide looks at materials for very short-term projects that are extremely inexpensive on up to more, slightly more permanent projects, but not quite fully permanent work. So this work, as we've documented it and as we've practiced it has had basically 3 phases. In 2005 through 2011, there was just kind of this surge of activism. A lot of it, particularly during the Great Recession, where people wanted to continue momentum and make streets safer, make communities more livable, and took power into their own hands to do that, and basically documented these little tiny things on the internet that became very big things, because you could all of a sudden, by 2005, you could share everything around the globe. So people in Sydney were learning from people, in Orange County, New York, let's say, right? You could really share these concepts, and so things spread really quickly. Cities, formerly city governments, started to really take note of this as the recession really kind of gripped so many communities that struggled through that period, not wanting to give up on plans and visions and ideas, but needing to make progress happen without a lot of resources. And so you started seeing, the image there is actually the New York City DOT, but many other communities take these just planters, tables, chairs, drop them into a street to see what would happen and start evaluating the results. So we're talking, very low cost projects from the start. And then finally, I think where we are now and where we've been for the last 3 or 4 years is the transformation of practice. It's not just the New Yorks of it, and it's not just activists in the middle of the night who are engaging in this practice, but it's planners who are learning this in school, or architects, it's city governments passing zoning, policies and creating programs to allow communities to do this kind of work. And so a lot of what we're focused on at Street Plans is that transformation, helping communities create processes that allow citizens and community organizations, consultants, et cetera, all work together to create these types of projects. So it's an approach that we use for public engagement. Very short-term projects for a couple days or a weekend is a great way to get a community out to, one, witness the change, but also learn about lots of initiatives that may be happening in any given place. Pilot and interim design projects, these are those that are meant to last longer than a few days, but are not meant to be permanent, right? So you want to try something for a little bit longer, really evaluate it in terms of how it's working, what the performance is, getting more feedback from people over a longer period of time. And then finally, policies and programs, as I mentioned. So we're creating these programs with communities around the globe now. So the benefits are that you encourage people to work together in new ways. It's one thing to be asked to come to a beautiful room like this and listen to a speaker like myself, and then engage in a project, a charrette, a workshop, or what have you. And it's a very another thing to ask people to come out into a neighborhood and physically do something together collectively. That's a very different kind of setting and situation, which we find to be very powerful. We call that experiential engagement. And then what this does is it helps us uncover what works quickly and, more importantly, what doesn't. So there's kind of a conservative approach built into this where rather than go and spend $100,000 or $1 million or $10 million, let's spend $1,000 or $10,000 first, work out the kinks in a design or a concept, get people to buy into it or not, and find that out quickly and inexpensively before you go and spend 5, 10, 20 years investing in something that in the end may not work. And then what we're trying to do is deliver public benefit faster. When these projects are successful, we can go very quickly from the very short term to kind of fast track projects because it builds a lot of political will and people can actually see the change and be a part of it. Or in short, this is what we're talking about. User experience versus design. Okay, this is a meme that you can find all over the internet, but it really does apply to our work in the sense that on the right is what planners and architects love to do. They think we know how to design for people in a given situation as professionals, and then people do all the stuff on the left, right? So we're trying to give people the opportunity to do the thing on the left and then design for the left rather than the right. So I'm going to structure this talk with kind of 10 rules or 10 lessons that we have learned over the last decade or so from our projects and collaborating with lots of different kinds of people. And one, of course, the first rule is that we have to put people first. And so when we're engaging in a project, let's say a transportation project, we don't conceive of that necessarily as a transportation project that has to do public engagement. We do the public engagement project that will end up with a transportation project in the end, right? So it's a very different type of approach than the conventional planning process. And when we do that, we get we get unexpected results. And so this is a project in Asheville, North Carolina that we worked on this past fall. And it was a local nonprofit bike organization that got a large grant from a donor, a single donor, and they wanted to do a street transformation, which we assumed would be about primarily cycling. But we told the client, like, this is the process we'd like to utilize. We'd like to invite as many people on the corridor as well as from the community to come in and have this conversation with us. And we'll design to what we hear rather than what we think or what you think is necessary on the street. And this Cox Avenue was selected because it's slated for reconstruction in about 4 years. So it's this nice window of time where you can engage in something very interim with known capital coming, but the interim can then inform exactly how that bigger project and the capital gets spent. And so over the course of the engagement with the community, we realized that this is not necessarily going to be a bike project. In fact, there were bike lanes already on the street. You can see in the lower right there on the left. It was going to be much more about the public realm and walking and not disallowing cycling, but being a little bit more inclusive in the design in terms of narrowing the street. You can see in the tan paint on either side, that became a way for people to walk in that space, to cycle, to take a scooter, to skateboard, etc. And so we encourage all sorts of different types of users to use that space. And so we spent a weekend with about 65 volunteers, and we painted what was about 0.4 miles of street, which is right on the edge of the community. And in the center of the community was a mural that was designed by a local artist. And the theme was transformation. And so the idea was these butterflies being the end result of a transformation, right? So this was the artist's design. We worked with them to get this figured out at scale on an actual urban street. And then the community came out and painted it. So everyone had a chance to really deliver this project, which again, that kind of process tends to be very memorable for people, and people feel ownership over that once it's delivered. Number two, and I can talk a lot more about that project if you have questions later. Number two, start smaller than you think. You may think having a couple $100 may seem like not a lot of money to make a big change, but I'm going to give you a story where that was absolutely the case. This is Hamilton, Ontario. Has anyone been to Hamilton? It's like the Pittsburgh of Canada. It's this old steel city, 500,000 people, fell on really hard times for many decades, but recently has been making a great comeback. And it's in the Greater Toronto region, right on the lake. And this person that you see literally screwing cones into the asphalt, which I don't recommend, by the way. You get a lot of kickback, but as we say, build, measure, learn. This is Graham McNally, who's an architect in town and relatively young, and he is part of an organization that's called the Society of Architects. And they've been very frustrated. This is back in 2013, by the way. They were very frustrated with the rate of change in their community for safer streets. And they had all the right policies, and they had all the right planners come to town, but the city politically didn't seem to have the will to make any change happen. So we engaged in a workshop with the Society of Architects and a bunch of different stakeholders there without the city's involvement, and picked 5 different intersections around the city that were prototypically, challenging, right? And we picked more suburban and more car-dominated intersections. We picked intersections such as this, was kind of made more car-dominated, but was in a historic neighborhood, and very walkable downtown streets as well. And this is the result of this one of the projects. And so the society had gave out these micro grants to 5 ideas that would get developed through our workshop. And they had $5,000 in total funding for the whole thing. And so we thought if we do at least 5, maybe one of them is going to work. So we take lots of little small bets, and maybe one of them is really going to spark. And that's exactly what happened with this location, which was these cones on one corner in front of the church, and then on the other corner in front of a school. This is a 2-lane, one-way street where, especially at rush hour, when parents are trying to get to work but also drop off their kids, a lot of people speed through the intersection. So it's kind of known to be a dangerous point. When the cones went out, the crossing guard, told the press, well, this is fantastic, this is cheap and quick, and it's making a difference for my kids. We did these 5 projects. I came back to do a talk at a much larger citywide event called Open Doors Hamilton. And at that point, the news media had really picked up on what had happened just about 10 days before. And then once the news article hit, then the city figured out that this stuff was happening, yes, illegally around town. And they were not happy. So this was a local blog called Raise the Hammer. It focuses on civic and urban issues. And the city went on the record of saying that, following this workshop, that this activity happened, it was dangerous, it was unsafe, obviously to say nothing of the existing condition of their streets. And the advocates fought back. They made this very tongue-in-cheek campaign online that spread via Facebook around town. Only you can stop urbanism. You see something remotely progressive, report it. And it kind of got the city to feel a little bit silly because they realized how much public support and interest there was in these projects. So that was, this is May 9th. Now this is May 19th. This has become a national story in Canada. Must have been a slow news day, but CBC picked it up. And the city then decided to come to the table and negotiate with these tactical urbanists. Well, what they found out was that these tactical urbanists were really respected leaders in the design field and in the community space in Hamilton. And they said, okay, let's start from scratch. Let's rethink this whole situation. Let's take the tense nature out of the conversation and think about how we could actually make this more long-lasting. In 5 days' time, they had gone out to that intersection and created much higher visibility crosswalks, and they put in these curb extensions using just paint and posts, very inexpensive. So they see an image of it. And it was meant to be a placeholder. And what was really interesting that the city didn't anticipate and the advocates didn't anticipate is that all of a sudden city councilors and other people from every other community who has unsafe streets kind of came out of the woodwork and said, we want that same treatment at our intersections because we have the same kinds of problems, right? And so all of a sudden it goes from being one intersection to they did more than 100 of them in less than 3 years. So when we talk about a really small little pinprick, a small project that costs a few $100s, rippling through our community and making lasting, scalable change, this is exactly what we're talking about. This is one of those case studies, and it came from people in the community at the grassroots who wanted to see change happen, and it then made its way and filtered up to policy. And it's only the city that has an opportunity to go from the one-off to scale it, and that's exactly what happened. And now there's been many articles written about Hamilton because they've taken this approach and just run with it in all sorts of different directions, not just about streets and crosswalks and things like that, but many other things. You can see here, Canada's smartest city is not Sidewalk Toronto, which if you know Toronto, they're working with Google to create this whole technology-soaked neighborhood, but it's really Hamilton that's doing these kinds of smart things that don't require technology that make a big difference. Or how this planning department is now the envy of many from around the country because they've taken this on. Lesson 3 is spread the love. So while you saw somebody in the middle of the night go out on his own and basically do this project, that can work, but we don't necessarily recommend that, right? I mean, it can be a powerful force for change, but at the end of the day, you're back at the table with the same people in government, or your community leaders, you're back with city councilors, with other folks, and it's a lot easier actually if you're starting to create a ground game for longer term change to obviously collaborate with lots of different types of people. So we really see communities as an ecosystem where you've got your bottom up, you've got your top down leadership, and then you've got people who are entrepreneurs, developers, maybe business improvement groups, artists, planning and design experts, et cetera, in the middle in that mix. And sometimes it's just, one to the other is how we work, but really we want to see things where lots of people have an opportunity to participate in these kinds of projects. So in downtown Miami, I will share this story, which was one that we started, here with a one-day project called Parking Day. Some of you may know, which is when one day every year in September, cities around the globe of all sizes will take over one or more parking spaces and make a little mini park. And this started with some activists in San Francisco deciding to do the same thing with no permission, but they just fed the meter with quarters and then put a park there instead of a car, right? So it was very clever. And we did this one day in Miami, maybe 5 or 6 years after that movement started. And a colleague came to us and said, well, this is great that you're doing this in one parking space, but we have Biscayne Boulevard here 1 block away, and it's 8 lanes of traffic. It's got these 6 medians in the middle of those 8 lanes, which are 100 feet wide, that are used for parking. And there's very little traffic on the street, except for, when there's a big, event like a Miami Heat professional basketball game. So he said, that's more of the problem, not this right here. And he was right. So he challenged us, and we went, this is in 2012, we went and we got a grant from the local Miami Foundation for $10,000. And $7,500 of that went to paying off the parking authority so we could get access to one of these parking lots, one of the 6. And what we wanted to do was basically take a concept that had been advanced in plan after plan for a generation of plans, take it off the shelf, and actually just go do it and show people this is an idea that has been created, but no one's been able to run with this and implement it. So with the rest of the $2,500, we partnered with 30 different organizations to deliver a 1-week test of creating this promenade, this beautiful park, this boulevard condition, which the street used to have before it got blown up into an 8-lane highway. And that's what that park became. And because we partner with 30 different organizations to not only deliver the project, like to actually physically make this happen, but then to program it, 30 different organizations could take the credit when it was a success, which it was. We also thought if it fails, we can spread the blame to 30 different organizations. But it was a success, and everyone felt like they had a piece of it. And that project was kind of this first iteration of this idea. The second iteration, after we proved that it was viable and that people would come and hang out in a public space in that setting, was a few years later, the Downtown Development Authority kind of ran with this idea, got a big grant for $160,000 or so. So now we're kind of taking it to this next level where it became not about one median and 1 week, but 3 of the medians over a month. So it's that next iteration. Of course, it's a few years later, but in any event, this space became, we designed it to be much more beautiful, to be more permanent. We had a lot more big events in the space. By day, it was a place to gather, drink coffee, meet up, work. By night, it was an event space for markets, for concerts, for the arts, et cetera. And in the end, what we did was when we removed the project after a month, we took away this space that people had really grown accustomed to and were starting to love. And that was the powerful thing. In fact, it was more powerful to take away than to add it. Because when we took it away, people started to really advocate for it to come back and get built. And so what you have here on the right is the city commissioner for that district, who in that meeting, in that presentation there, was promising to make this permanent before the end of his office term. Now he's nearly up, so he hasn't done it yet, but he's been working towards that since. And that's what's required to get the political buy-in to go get the $7 million, which is going to be required to make this project happen. So again, it's that iteration that we've been trying to do to build that political will long term. When you go out and do your projects, you can control the design of it at the smallest scale or the biggest scale, but you can't control the weather, especially here in the Northeast. This is a fun project we worked on in New Britain, Connecticut at the end of last fall. And this project was part of a regional effort with the Metropolitan Planning Organization of Hartford, which includes 38 different communities. And our task was to help the communities understand how to do implementation work. And so we wanted to do a project with a community to really showcase something in the region, because this work had not happened very much before. So this is a neighborhood in New Britain, a little bit east of their downtown. It's a very working class neighborhood with, in this particular area, this is a new YWCA. And then there's a big park kind of on the end of this street, maybe, you know, a half mile away. But this site here, I want you to pay attention to this configuration, because this is what we look at when we look for designs for public spaces. This leg here in the intersection is redundant. With such low volumes of traffic, typically in a residential context, you don't need both of these to go on this street. So we oftentimes look for this condition, take this out of service for the cars, and then just make people do this. And so that's what this project became as a concept, was to turn this into more of a public plaza, to double the size of this little park, and then have the YWCA be able to use this as their outdoor space, because they actually don't have any. So it was kind of a win-win, where we would get a stewardship partner to help manage the space. Well, we planned this whole thing for over the course of about 6 weeks. We ordered more than 7,000 gallons of paint. And what happened was a nor'easter was scheduled for the day that we were going to implement the project. And that was going to be on a Saturday. And we were going to have this huge community-wide cleanup day. We would have tons of volunteers, and we would paint the 8,000 square feet or whatever. And we had to push everything up a day, which meant that we lost almost our entire volunteer base, because this nor'easter was going to slam in Connecticut. If you remember, it was right after Halloween of this past year. So we had to speed things up, and then, of course, the paint didn't show up on time. So we had ordered the paint in one bulk order from Home Depot. The paint wasn't going to arrive. So now we're really up a creek, and we basically wound up going to 3 different Home Depots, stitching together the paint order, store by store, in an afternoon. And we showed up with the paint. We were able to measure out the honeycomb pattern, which was basically, it's the city's logo is a beehive. So we're kind of playing off of that, and these, the colors we use are the city colors, and that's the same space. So this is 8,000 square feet. You can see we allowed people to access their driveways just here, but they didn't need all this space, so we doubled the size of the park. And we wound up getting everyone from the mayor to the public works department to other city employees come out on their Friday. They basically took half a day off from work to come paint this thing with us so we could get it done. And while we typically rather do this with community members and residents in the neighborhood, the value of doing it with the city was that they thought it was a ton of fun, and they realized that this is not crazy stuff. This actually was well thought out, and it works, and that they were all, while we were painting, talking about all these other locations around town where they wanted to do this. Right, and this is for this whole thing cost less than $10,000. There you see an aerial of the space, and then lessons were learned. Right, this is just from an email I got from the director of public works about some of the changes they already want to make to the park to tweak it a little bit. And you can see here, this is the next day. This is his car. He was checking out the plaza after they got all this snow. City government, though, as much as we love working with cities, they can't do it themselves entirely all the time, right? You need partnerships of neighborhood groups, bids, businesses, advocacy organizations to all band together to get things done. This is an example in Norfolk, Virginia, where Norfolk has a pretty severe flooding problem in some of their historic neighborhoods, which were built on landfill over time. And so they're getting water that's seeping up as the ocean rises around them, and they're also getting heavier and more rain events, which brings rain, water obviously from above. And so the city is pretty resource strapped. They're one of 100 cities in a network called the 100 Resilient Cities. That's funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And as part of that, they create a resiliency strategy. And as part of that resiliency strategy, they realize they have to work with property owners to work on stormwater management and retention. And so we worked with the community that's most threatened by stormwater issues to go out and implement 4 or 5 different interventions in one place that would help retain rain. And so here you can see people depaving the sidewalk. This is setting up rain barrels to collect rain off the downspouts of buildings, off the rooftops. And then we created this branding and programming around this idea and had this workshop where we showed people how to do these types of interventions. and then gave the city recommendations on how to move forward after the workshop. And what that resulted in with our recommendation was to create a program where they would fund at small amounts of dollars citizens to do these interventions themselves on their own properties. And those grants are up to $2,000. They could be $20, they could be up to $2,000 to do 9 different types of interventions that the city would just sanction outright based on very basic conditions that you would have to meet on your property. And this has been underway now for about 2 years. And so you're not going to solve their flooding problems overall if the ocean's rising around them, but we can mitigate over time with these incremental interventions, not 1, not 10, but 100, 1,000 start to make a difference when they have a big rain event. So this is where a real city and citizen partnership is working towards a more resilient city in some of their more threatened neighborhoods. So I talked about this briefly, but aligning materials with project duration is pretty critical. So as you go out and do your projects, you have to think about what are your resources, how much can you spend, how long do you want your project to last, and how do you match materials to make sure that you can do that, right? And that's a really key kind of decision-making framework to go through with these projects. Our guide goes through a bunch of different types of project elements and then assigns them to either a demonstration project interval, which is 1 day to a month, a pilot project interval is 1 month to a year, or interim design, which is 1 year to 5 years. Okay, and so interim is what we look at when you have a gap between having a successful demonstration or pilot, but then not having the resources to take that next step into permanent construction of something. So it's that filling that gap space. So the guide runs through all the materials, the estimated costs, how to apply it, tips and considerations, and then sources. So it'd be really useful for some of your projects. And again, we match the materials to these 3 different timescales or intervals, which then ideally result in long-term capital. And I want you to know you don't feel like you have to go through all 3 of these steps to get here. Sometimes you can go from one to the last. You can start maybe even here and go to there. But there are tools and there's processes and materials that work in these 3 buckets. And you can see here Burlington, Vermont as a demonstration project example. This is less than $100 of tempera paint. That was a sidewalk extension of an event where 10,000 people get crammed onto about 4 blocks for an art festival on these 5-foot sidewalks. So this was being responsive to that need with a very light touch that created space for people to gather and eat food from the food trucks during this big event. Burlington also has passed a pilot project process where they test materials. So this whole effort was part of our outreach for a bike and pedestrian master plan. This design was a road diet going from 4 lanes down to 2, and they were testing different materials. And this was a 1-year pilot to see what the feedback was from the community, to see which the barrier element they liked more, the one that's more visible but ugly, or lower, less visible but maybe less ugly. And then that has then led to this program we developed with them for interim design, right? So these are projects that have come out of our master plan and bike plan with them that use an interim design toolkit. So things that will last for several years, but are not meant to last for 5, 10, 20 years, right? You have to refresh them or hopefully invest in more permanent infrastructure. So I'm showing you these images that there's 3 different types of examples. As a community, you can put these processes and these materials to work for those reasons. And a lot of this lives in this guide that we created. You can download this off their website. It's design standards and material standards for what we're calling quick build projects. Measuring and communicating failure is probably as important as communicating success. This was from that Asheville project. So remember, the intent of this was to last for 6 months. And within 6 days, this is what the paint started to look like. So we had a massive material failure from that big, beautiful project I showed you earlier. And the lesson learned here was that the manufacturer of the paint, which we had worked with before, told us we could put the paint down at temperatures as low as 35 degrees. When we installed this in the fall, it's Asheville, it's in the mountains, it was chilly, it was about 40 degrees. They'd also come off of a week of rain, so there was a lot of moisture in the ground. And what wound up happening is that after we painted the asphalt, it started to crack, chip, and come up. And so this was such a big project for the community. It was, took 65 people, had the bike advocacy organization's name was all over this, their reputation was on the line, and this became a severe challenge. I can finish that story later. In the end, it's all turned out fine, but these are the things that you come up against, and you need to be able to prepare for failure. That Biscayne Green project, we had over 23 days when it was live and available for use. We had more than 20,000 people. And we did a lot of evaluation and took a lot of measured a lot of data related to the project. And we learned a lot. For example, we had far more men in the space. 59% of users were men versus female. So if we're going to design this to be a park and a public space long term, we need to design for gender parity, right, to match the demographics of the city. So how do we do that? Well, then that's now a question that can inform the next design process, where you can start to really think about the activities, the programming, the design elements that would be more inclusive. So that's why we, again, do these projects, so we can learn this type of information so you don't design and build something without that knowledge. Ultimately, you can't scale what you can't permit. So we've had to reinvent the wheel for years in communities that we've worked in, going in and basically hacking together a way to get permission to do this work, because it's been very atypical in most places. And that's proven to be very frustrating for us. So as I mentioned, over the last few years, we've been developing these programs and policies to make sure that we can go through that frustrating process, because we know how to now, but we don't want citizens to have to come up against that and not be able to make change happen. So this is a big project across Miami-Dade County, where we had 2 different grants over 2 successive years, and we ran a contest. We went to the whole county and said, we've got money, we'll give you technical assistance, come to us with your project ideas, and we're going to select more than a dozen of them to implement. And so we were trying to do something at scale, but with starting with these small projects in different communities. And so we had 68 applications, and we selected 18 of them. And then we had leveraged another $150,000 in local funding from various partners and community members. And a big focus of this was access to transit. So getting people from neighborhoods or main streets onto the bus system or onto the rail system, and making those spaces safer and more intuitive, and more public space around those stops and stations. So again, 18 projects. We're taking little bets. We're trying to find a couple that will be a huge success. This one so far, we're still implementing the program, but this one has been a huge success. This was put forth by a local business group in a village called Miami Shores, which is north of Miami, and they wanted a gathering space in their commercial center where they didn't have one. So what we did was we painted this beautiful mural on the street, which a few times a month is used like this, but otherwise you can still see the lines on the ground here. It's used for parking. So it can be a very flexible space that's both public for parking when you have that demand, but also you can close it down, this half block, and make it a plaza, and it's next to one of the busiest bus lines that runs up and down Northeast 2nd Avenue. So that was kind of the connection to the transit piece. Reinventing this, creating this process, even though the Miami-Dade County has been our client on this, working with them has been extremely challenging. So we had to get the politicians to create a resolution to basically help us streamline the work that the county wanted us to do. It's a very odd reality, but it's where we've been. So now there's a much easier process where you can do these projects more long-term, and you don't need street plans necessarily to do them. And that's the kind of thing we're trying to leave behind in different communities. So the future of this movement is that, programs and policy, it doesn't sound sexy, but ultimately if we're going to get to scalability and have this be part of practice, we need to do this kind of work, which we're doing, as I mentioned, all over the place. And creating these very simple, easy to understand processes, more complex for government, much simpler for citizens on the steps you need to take to get permission. 9 to 10, we're almost done here, guys. Thanks for your patience. If you build it, you've got to steward it, right? You've got to maintain it. And so thinking about that before you build something, even if it's going to last more than a couple weeks, is really critical. Even just a month-long project, you got to think about who's going to pick up the trash, who's going to clean the space, who's going to program it, who's going to put out the chairs, bring them back in at night. Those kinds of decisions need to be thought before you implement, not after. And so we see a lot of community partners and advocates go out and have tons of energy and excitement, which is wonderful, and then go do these things, and then they don't think about this piece to it, and then pretty soon it starts to kind of fall apart. It doesn't have someone to take care of it, and all of a sudden that becomes a maintenance liability and a challenge for the city. So just be aware of that, right? And so we've developed this guide for the city of San Francisco, which is really just a best practice look at from very low-resourced, low-cost, community-led events, on up to partnership models, to public-private partnerships, to special assessment districts, and then technical assistance programs, looking at all the different characteristics of public space and how to manage and steward those things, even from the very temporary one-day kind of thing to more permanent places. So in the end, what we're doing in communities that we work with, we're not creating plans. We're not there to create plans. Like, that might be the product that comes out of a process, but we're really trying to write stories. We're trying to get people involved with things for the long term and have them take projects that we start and carry them forward for the 5, the 10, the 20 years to really change and transform communities of any size and type. And this happens to be an example of an image in Jersey City where we've been doing a lot of work. In fact, the whole approach here was to improve walkability and safety on 6 of the most dangerous streets in their 6 ward districts. And so our role in this project was to develop these very colorful, artful curb extensions before there was a walking workshop where community advocates would come through, and we would have set up the curb extensions and show them what's possible and make them, see how their streets could be made to be more safe very quickly. And so we got a lot of feedback from these walking workshops. We were able to show the city how the geometry worked and how the materials worked. And then it led us to create policy for them that will help them have a lot more options on the curbside. So Jersey City is a very dense, very walkable, transit-served place, but they don't use their curbs maybe as efficiently as they can. So you can park, 9 people here, 10 people, or you can park, 9 or 10 bikes in one space, right? So we're looking at not all these things on one block, but all the elements that can be curbside that can add value to walkability and to adjacent businesses and properties, like public space, transportation things like, floating bus stops and make bus transit run better, to delivery and ride-hail stops. So if you have a delivery zone, maybe that's used from 7 to 10 in the morning, but maybe that can be a ride-hail stop on a block, for the rest of the day. So you just know to walk to that spot, or the person who's trying to pick you up doesn't have to double park to wait for you to come out of your, the business or the home, that they actually have a space that's curbside, and they move on and off the curb very quickly. So we're trying to get these kinds of policies and programs in place. So again, our work is about scale and getting to scalability. So the city took this idea, of which we implemented with traffic tape, plants from Home Depot, and tempera paint. So just a couple $100 per intersection that we spent, and they created 50 new curb extensions on those streets and many other dangerous intersections as well. And so why these matter is they shorten the crossing distance for pedestrians and make people more visible when they're the most vulnerable when they're trying to cross the street. And turning cars hopefully will now see them more. So they've done 50 of these just in year 1 alone. And then project 2 of them has been creating this bike and pedestrian master plan. As we've been creating this over the last year, scooters and e-skateboards and all these new modes of transportation have popped up everywhere. It's been that quick. And so we want to try out a design that was intended to be inclusive of a much broader audience. So while we're doing a bike plan, yes, we want to think about ways to design the infrastructure to be more inclusive of a wider audience of people, which is why this lane is 75% wider than most lanes in the city. And when we tried this out for 4 days, we got, as intended, a lot of people off the, the very congested sidewalks and into the street space where they were safe, and it made the sidewalks more pleasant. Lots of positive feedback from that, and we're using this to inform our designs for their Bikeway Design Guide, which will have a whole chapter on integrating other forms of mobility, we call micromobility, into what looks more like bike lanes. So we've learned 2 important things, that city departments, organizations, community groups are really hungry for a new way to deliver projects. But to do that, you need new tools, new materials, you need policies and programs, and to think differently about project delivery. And so putting that into play is really critical work in the mid to long term. So the next steps for us is we're working on a bunch of new reports and studies, which will be coming out soon, on tactical transit, so how to speed up and make buses more accessible, on the art of asphalt, which will be all about color and how you apply color on streets. And then volume 2 of the materials and design guide will also be coming out soon with a bunch of new materials we've used of late and case studies. So we do this work because the brain tends to remember 10% of what it reads, 20% of what it hears, but 90% of what it does or what it simulates. So we're really doing the 90%. We're trying to really simulate this change so people really can grab onto it and run with it in the end. So with that, thank you very much, and I will take, I think, some questions.
Hi, my name is Rachel Lucy. I'm from Goshen in the Village. My question for you is, how do you deal with funding as a private citizen advocating to get these projects to go ahead? For lots of grants, you have to have the banking in place for if you do get accepted, that funds has to go somewhere and then be spread out. So what would you suggest?
A few things. One, when we were advocating for this 7, 8, 9 years ago, there was absolutely no funding for this whatsoever. Like there was no money. So it was all about people just pulling together a few of their own dollars and going and spending $100 on a project and getting it done. Now, there are foundations and lots of funders who are more engaged in this work. Cities are starting to pay for it. But there's also platforms like IOBI. Have you heard of IOBI?
No.
It's a nonprofit organization, and IOBI is an acronym for In Our Backyard.
Okay.
And it's basically what they call a crowdfunding, but also a crowd resourcing platform to raise funds for exactly these kinds of projects. And they work all over the United States. They fund projects all over the United States. And what's great about them as a mission-based organization is that they have a whole staff that can do technical assistance. And so they're on the phone with you, they're answering emails, they're helping you create your project and deliver your project, measure your project, as well as helping you with having the expertise on how to raise $500. That for a lot of people, that's a really daunting task. It may not seem like a ton of money, but it's the task of going and asking people for money is not comfortable for a lot of folks. So the online piece of it can be really helpful and can teach you how to do that. So there's lots of those different tools that are out there now that you can utilize to get your money. We as a private company, you might have noticed we get a lot of grants. So we wind up partnering with nonprofit organizations a lot where the money runs through them and then they pay us in return. So that's how we get the grant dollars to flow into our projects is we very rarely get paid ourselves. It just goes through another grant-making organization. So that's how we can work that way.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
My name is Christina LaPearl, and I'm on the Placemaking Committee. Thanks for that presentation. It was awesome. I just have a question regarding measuring the results, because Danielle and I are going to be talking about some grants that are going to be available for these type of projects, and we would like the receivers of the grants to provide some data in terms of the results of the project. Is there a particular guide, or do you have any recommendations for how community members can collect data in terms of maybe traffic calming or number of people visiting a space? What's a way people can do that?
Yeah, well, I think before you even start measuring, you should really determine with your project what the goal is, right? What are we trying to achieve? And then that can give you some insight into what you should measure. If you're trying to slow traffic, then absolutely measuring the speed of traffic is going to be important. And so what we have done in those instances where if you don't have access to professional traffic counting equipment, which most people don't, is use a radar gun that you can buy at a sporting goods store that you would just, you'd use for a pitcher. You can measure the speed of someone who's pitching a baseball. You can grab those off the shelf, and then they will be accurate enough to do what they need to do for that kind of project. So you would go out there, you would measure cars going by, and you would pick a certain time of day, certain weather condition, and you'd measure it. And then you'd go back after you've installed your project, and the same kind of weather, the same time of day, and you would measure again and see if your project had any impact. So it's a pretty basic way, but it gives you some insight into, did this make a change in the speed of traffic? That's quantitative, right? And there's lots of things you could measure: the amount of people using a space before and after, the ways they're using the space. But there's also the qualitative, right, which is how people feel or how people react to a space. And so if you are in a village center, let's say, and you want to talk to people about how they feel walking in the community, ask them. You either have a paper survey, have a single question, maybe 3 at most, get that feedback, and then do your project, and then say, does this make a difference for you in how you walk? Now, there's lots more scientific ways to do that, but for the purpose of these kinds of projects at the scale you're probably going to be working, don't overcomplicate it. Just get a sense of, do people like this or not? Do we slow down cars or not? Do we make the street safer or not? And that'll help you kind of carry it forward.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, hi, my name's Wynn Gold. I'm from the town of Cornwall. I love the idea of Parking Day. I've been thinking about that ever since you mentioned it. My question is, how do you get the word out? And if you're not going to request permission but seek a pardon afterwards, and you use social media, how do you keep it secret enough so that you can pull it off, but yet public enough so that you can get people out there?
Great question. Well, I think choosing a place obviously that has foot traffic is important. Partnering with a business in which the parking space is in front of is very important because the business has patrons. So the business, it's a private establishment. People go in there, they buy their coffee or they buy their whatever they're buying or do what they do, get their paper. And in that setting, that's a place I think to quietly maybe advertise or let patrons of that shop know, hey, come back on your regular course of day-to-day life and come check out this space. We're doing this tomorrow. So you can do that kind of engagement directly in a business. I mean, a lot of communities already permit this to happen, so you don't have to be secretive about it. And if you can get permission from the community, the government ahead of time, then you can advertise it far and wide with social media, with posters around town. It's always really helpful to advertise, the couple days before of what's coming. You can kind of do a little mock picture or rendering and just stick it up on the parking meter or in the space and say, coming soon, a new park to downtown Cornwall or however you want to put it. So that's another idea on how you could engage people and the understanding that to come and use the space.
Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. Yeah, great. In the visuals, I see something that we pay attention to a lot, which is leveraging, in our terms, leveraging arts and culture to be able to get people's attention. And in the Biscayne medians, obviously very design-led, what that was going to look like in the end, and then all of the murals on the ground. Can you just speak some about the power specifically of like coming at it with a strong creative voice?
Sure. I mean, it's critical to make these things beautiful, right? To make them engaging, colorful, different from the day-to-day that's part of your life in any given place. And then we look at the arts and community organizations who are in the arts as being just incredible. It's an incredible network to tap into, because if you partner with a local organization or an artist and they're engaged, they're going to tell their whole network about it and they're going to share it, and it's going to spread really, really quickly around a community. And so it's a really important tactic that we use as people who come from outside of town, is to find those people who are already kind of creatively minded or doing interesting things and just give them space to be engaged and do what they do in a place that we've been actually asked to transform. And so it's really fun to kind of take our approach and understanding of things like rules and regulations and traffic and mash that up with people who've got a really creative idea for transformation that could happen in the space. So sometimes we partner very formally with arts groups or artists, and sometimes we just use our own design sense and have people who may be interested in that to come participate, but they may not be the formal designers of a space. So it really kind of depends. But I think overall it's extremely valuable if you've got that kind of a group of people who are already present in a community who can take advantage of that. Like, that's so much talent to just leverage in the day-to-day, let alone for just a single project that can be part of the community's development. So always helpful.
How do you balance to keep it inclusive, not exclusive, when you're trying to vision a project and to try to get more community engagement? How do you get to kind of bring it more and scale it down to like a final vision, and when to give that kind of cutoff without people feeling that they were left behind in the process?
That's an awesome question. It's always challenging to strike that balance. I think we have to remember that the project is the community engagement, right? The act of doing it and having it be there in an impermanent way brings that concern level down a few notches in a community, because people understand when they learn that it's temporary, that they weren't left behind in the process necessarily. That being said, we do a lot of our engagement actually out in the street, in the neighborhood, where people are, rather than we do these events, but we don't do those alone. We're out there on the street doing even smaller, micro little interventions, on the sidewalk or in a parking space, just to talk to people all day long and get them to be informed and get their feedback on what they would like to see done before we go to a bigger scale engagement or before we do the project. So the types of engagement really run the gamut, and sometimes we've got a big budget. Like in Asheville, we had a big budget, and so we could do a lot of engagement as part of this process, which I think always results in something that's better. In New Britain, we had a bit of a budget to deliver the project. We didn't have much budget ahead of time to do the engagement, unfortunately, but the project was going to be the engagement of all these people in this community. So we were feeling really good about that. And of course, the weather hit, and we had to do it on a Friday rather than a Saturday. And we got some people from students from the YWCA in the afternoon after school to come help us. But for the most part, it was just the city. And like I said, that had some benefit. But so it runs that gamut.
Just one quick follow-up question.
Sure.
Being that you start with something small, like say with parks, you do one project, and then more people get involved. Do you find that it then divides up into separate groups to take on different initiatives, or do you feel like it's always the same people moving on to the next thing?
It really depends. Yeah, I think it depends on the scale of the project and the community and who's involved. I mean, definitely things can splinter and grow. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. But, oftentimes projects like Plaza 98 are, they're big enough and enough to manage on a monthly basis that you do need like smaller groups of people doing certain things. Like some folks have to leverage their contacts and get the entertainment booked, twice a month. And then other people have to make sure that they're on, the maintenance and the garbage pickup and the cleanup after the party happens in the plaza, like that kind of thing. So it's, you break up the responsibilities.
Okay. And so how many people do you think you need to really lead a committee to get things going?
It can be as small as 3.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's usually better than coming just from a single individual, right? You get different various perspectives and people's various connections in the community and whatnot. But, I wouldn't say you want 30 people on a committee, right? But, 5, 7, 10 people who can be engaged, because some people have, we all have lives, and most people do this kind of work on the side. We've been extremely lucky to make a life out of this in terms of this is the work that we do, but a lot of people are engaging in this because they're passionate and they want to be a part of it, but then things happen to people and you can't always be participating. So building in a little bit of resiliency in your group and in your committee, if you're going to start to steward and create some of these projects, I think is always just a smart move.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, Leslie Smith. You said these are temporary, short-term projects, and you use a lot of paint. How does that paint hold up? And if the project is ended and you're left with this paint all over the place, then what happens?
You guys have good questions. So back to the point or the lesson learned about matching the material to the duration. Tempera paint is non-toxic and it will 98% be washed away after the first rainstorm that comes. So when we're doing projects that are, for a weekend or a week long in intent, sometimes shorter if it rains, it kind of takes care of itself. If we're looking at something that's more like 6 months or a year, that paint we use is different quality, and it can last not only the 6 months, it can last for several years. It will fade and weather over time. You can slow that pace of weathering if you put a sealant over top after the paint dries, so sometimes that makes things last longer if that is the goal. Or if something does not work or is deemed a failure, people want to change the art or remove it, you can usually power wash the paint off. And that is, it's a little bit resource intensive in terms of having people out there to do it and getting a pressure washer, but it will work pretty well to get the paint off. And again, in the Northeast, for better or for worse, we've got these winters and a lot of weather, and so the paint can, if you want it to go, it'll go relatively quickly over the course of a winter or two without having to be power washed. And so a lot of our projects just kind of fade, and then they can be refreshed with a new vision or a new mural or something at a later date. Welcome.
Mike, great presentation. Brian Fitzpatrick from the Village of Montgomery. Before you do any project, I was curious of whether or not you've worked with villages, communities, to sort of do some type of just consensus of what are the priorities. What is the village? Rather than the parking space, how did you pick that one?
Right.
Because we do a lot of stuff and everyone has a different what we should be doing type of idea. So do you have a formal process for that?
Yeah, we do a lot of workshops which are exploratory for those very reasons. We don't, supposed to know what the priority is for any given community, and so these projects come out of that process most typically. Occasionally not, but most of our projects are meeting with a group of people who are interested, meeting with the city, seeing what that mashup of possibility and ideas are, and then we try to create iterations of proposals with the community that say, is it like this, is it like that, and help them get to where they want to go. And sometimes we're not involved in the implementation, we're just there at the ideas phase and kind of give it a boost and give a community the permission. It already the permission it thinks it needs to go do what they can do without us, honestly. So we do those kinds of visioning and workshops to arrive at what should be done and how. Thank you guys all for coming this morning. I really appreciate it, listening to me talk. But also, I think the point you brought up at the beginning of the Q&A about places, I showed you a lot of kind of bigger cities and advanced projects. We've done a lot in smaller communities, but I want to say it's actually, when we have done work in smaller communities, it's easier. It's a lot easier than working in a New York or a Miami, quite frankly. And so it takes less money, it takes less time, there's less bureaucracy. You probably know the town manager. You need permission from 1 or 2 people. So if you're at all discouraged about these being big city ideas, trust me, they're not. They're better at the scale of a village or a small town. So good luck with your projects, and I think that's it for me, right?
Thank
So,
you. Yes,
thanks.
Mike, thanks very much. Did you?
Well, thank you, Mike. That was very inspiring. I'm Danielle Farrell, and this is Christina LaPearl, and we're both members of the Orange County Citizens Foundation and on the board. And today we get to talk to you about what we can offer you in terms of startup grants to implement pop-up placemaking or tactical urbanism. So as you know, every year the Citizens Foundation gives out awards for people who are making great places in Orange County. And this year, to stay with the theme of the tactical urbanism, we've decided to actually give out up to 10 $250 startup grants to communities who are interested in implementing these type of projects. This would be for the pilot projects that Mike had spoken about, the very preliminary beginning projects to kind of see what could be done. And then eventually we will pick one grand prize winner amount that we have not yet determined that we will be discussing and throughout the process, and we'll be giving that at our November placemaking conference. So the applications are actually here today, and you can pick them up or you can get them on our website, and the application deadline is April 30th. The projects will then need to be substantially complete by October so that we can select our winners for the grand prize in November.
So some key expectations of the projects are that they must be completed quickly. As Danielle pointed out, they must be substantially complete by October 15th so that we can judge them in time for the November conference. We would like you to get public input, especially across different demographic groups and socioeconomic groups. So we're really looking for a wide range of community input. You must get all necessary approvals from municipalities and property owners. We don't want people, coming to the Citizens Foundation and being extremely angry about, a project that's been implemented. And when we're assessing the applications, we'll give special consideration to projects that enhance parks, playgrounds, schools, daycare settings, shopping areas, transit stops, areas that children visit often, and also underserved areas where there's not a lot of placemaking going on currently. So the objectives of your planning and implementation process for these projects, as I said, would be to engage the public and help the public guide what type of project is implemented. We want to see what your short-term and long-term goals are. As Mike talked about, you might be doing something as a pilot project that will eventually turn into something more permanent for the community. We would like you to work closely with local state officials and to follow all accepted engineering and design principles and safety protocols. We don't want anyone getting hurt. And it's great if you can integrate, as Mike talked about, the project in Norfolk, Virginia, where they integrated education into the project, where they showed how planners reduce runoff after a rain. So those kind of things are wonderful. And if you can, don't be intimidated by this, but if you could provide some before and after data, as Mike talked about. Maybe you can go out and do informal surveys just to see how people perceive the project? Has it increased their level of happiness as they're walking around the space? Or you can simply measure the flow of traffic with an inexpensive radar gun, something like that we'd like to see.
So now we'll talk about the application requirements. Like I said, they're available today. It is a 4-page application, but don't be intimidated by that. We just want to get a good idea as to what you're suggesting for implementation. We'd also like a letter of support from the municipality. We want to make sure that they're on board with the project, however large or small it is. And a map showing the project location. If you have renderings or conceptual plans, they don't need to be professional, just something to give us an idea as to what you're proposing. We really think that having before pictures is very important, so that we can also look at the before and after photos when we're looking to see who we're going to give the grand prize to. And then any other supporting documentation that you think would help us better understand your project and what you're trying to implement. For the application, the scoring criteria, you can read this. This is just something that the categories that we think that we'll be looking at. Obviously, we want to know the community impact, and then also the community engagement. We've been talking about that all morning. The project delivery, we want to make sure that it's not too large of a project, that it's something that you're actually going to be able to implement within the time frame that we've outlined. And then also innovation. We want to make sure that it's a project that has a lot of creativity and that will really inspire the people that are using it.
As Danielle said, the applications are due by Wednesday, April 30th. And really, you can just go to the Citizens Foundation website. There's a PDF, you can download it, it's form fillable. And then you could email that to jmasterson at OCCitizensFoundation.org, or you can snail mail it to the address listed on the PowerPoint there. And we just wanted to, Mike's already pointed out these resources, but we took the photos shown in the PowerPoint from these 2 resources. They're fantastic. And there's I think, is that your website? Yes. Okay, yeah. So you can visit www.streetplans.org to get access to these resources and to check out the website. It's fantastic. And that's it. I'm going to pass it back to Danielle.
Yeah. Again, we just want to say thank you to Mike for being here today. We hope that this has kind of started to spark a lot of interest and ideas for everyone. And I just want to remind you that the Citizens Foundation is a membership organization, and our memberships are what allow us to have events like this today. So if you'd like to join and be part of the conversation throughout the company or throughout the county, we are offering a 10% discount code through April 30th, which is when the applications are due, and it's pop-up all in lowercase. So we encourage you to join us if you'd like. Right? Thank you.
Terrific. Well conceived, well delivered.